The true story of Egypt's last queen has been obscured by soap opera and scandal.
The life of Cleopatra is a mystery, but she was a magical queen. Her beauty captured the hearts of the most two powerful people on earth.
She was in charge when the great civilization of ancient Egypt finally fell. And the version we have of Cleopatra's story was written by the men who defeated her, the Romans.
The Romans put the spin on the Cleopatra tale. They turned her into a salacious harlot, this bubble-headed sex kitten who's jumping in and out of bed with any available Roman.
But there was more to her than that. This was a woman who came to power at 18 and kept the Romans at bay for over 20 years. The more historians discover about her, the more she appears as an extraordinary woman of her times, one who made no distinction between private and political life. The choices she made helped shape world history, and yet physical evidence of her reign is hard to find.
Even though Cleopatra is so famous, most of what we know about her is hearsay or myth. It's important to look for Egyptian evidence of Cleopatra because she's the ruler of Egypt. It's her home and it's her country. If we find Egyptian evidence, then we'll have the Egyptians' own perspective on Cleopatra's reign, not the Romans.
Cleopatra was born into a unique period in Egyptian history, one where two cultures had fused to produce an entirely new society. While she may be remembered as an Egyptian, she was actually the product of a Greek dynasty who'd arrived in Egypt some 300 years before.
These people were basically Greeks from northern Greece in Macedonia, what we call it today. The dynasty was founded by Ptolemy, one of Alexander the Great's generals, who followed him across Asia. He essentially took control of Egypt and founded his own dynasty here. Essentially, the Ptolemies were Greek and Egyptian.
The Egyptians had been building their own unmistakable monuments for 2,500 years, but the Ptolemies still left their mark. Egypt's cities are full of ruined Greek-style buildings. Even here at Saqqara, the pharaoh's ancient burial ground, there are statues of great Greek thinkers, Homer, Plato, and others.
After several unremarkable Ptolemaic rulers, the last real ruler of the Ptolemaic period of Egypt was Cleopatra. She ended that Hellenistic period begun by Alexander several hundred years previously.
But the Ptolemies didn't trample on Egyptian tradition. They went to great lengths to show that they respected it. They adopted local customs, depicting themselves in Egyptian dress and building new temples to Egyptian gods. Evidence of this fusion of cultures still survives across Egypt, but one of the best examples lies hidden beneath the streets of modern Alexandria. Colin Clement is visiting the tombs of Kom el Shafka in the southwest of the city.
This is a guardian of the tomb, head of Anubis. Now, Anubis represents the ancient Egyptian religion. He was the afterworld. And then down here, rather than legs, we have the tail of the Agatha demon snake, a beneficial god of the Hellenistic period. This is a perfect example of the mix that Alexandria became.
And this is the world into which Cleopatra was born. These two great cultures, fusing here, dominated the ancient world, defining the way people thought, lived, and built.
It is rather clumsily done. It's a mishmash. But nonetheless, it is very, very striking.
In Ptolemaic Egypt, the mixing of Greeks and Egyptians resulted in a melting pot, and Alexandria was typical of that, so that people understood Greek and Egyptian language, and they started to make architecture and art that used some Greek forms, but also some Egyptian elements.
The same mix would have played a part in the way Cleopatra was brought up. She had an Egyptian's belief in the absolute power of the pharaoh, and a Greek's reverence for knowledge and learning.
She could be regarded as the ultimate educated woman. She was clearly a woman of stature, of great intellect and multilingual skills.
Contemporary experts believe that Cleopatra's education prepared her for victory in the wider world. She was taught to speak 9 or 10 languages.
Her knowledge as a queen to rule Egypt came because she lived in the most cultured, wonderful city in the world in that time.
We could consider her the epitome of learning and aristocratic bearing, perhaps linked to the idea of Alexandria as the centre of learning in the ancient world, focused on the famous Alexandria Library.
Alexandria's library was at the heart of Cleopatra's world. Today, the place where it once stood is occupied by a modern library, built as a monument to the ancient building. Centuries before the coming of the printing press, it's said to have held over 700,000 scrolls. Generations of Cleopatra's ancestors were ruthless in their ambition to make this city an international centre of learning and ideas.
The Ptolemies went aggressively to try to get a copy of every single book that was in existence. And they even had customs agents search vessels that pulled into the port. And if they found a book on board that was not in the library, the book was confiscated and brought to the library. It represents the world's first think tank. And the Ptolemies, Cleopatra included, were in a position to pay scholars simply to think and use their brains. She encouraged research and scholarship on a purely academic, intellectual, idealistic level.
But there's another building which reveals how Cleopatra's dynasty wanted to be seen. A structure that represented their public face. It was literally the first thing that anyone arriving at the port of Alexandria would see. The Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world.
There are written texts from antiquity which tell us of this large tower built of white stone standing on the tip of the Isle of Pharos. So we have images, but none are hugely detailed.
These texts describe an impossibly high monument, commissioned by Cleopatra's forefather Ptolemy as a beacon by which ships could navigate. But it's another part of Cleopatra's story where myth obscures the facts.
The breakthrough in the recent years is our discovery of elements of the monumental doorway to it. We've found both door jambs and the lintel.
Jean-Yves Empereur led the team which, in 1994, uncovered these massive pieces of stone lying on the seabed. He believes they once formed the doorway of the Pharos.
These are 2 fragments of the colossal gate of the lighthouse. And it was broken with an earthquake. And so we could pick them out from the seawater. But still there is the other one, the twin one, and also the lintel. And so we have the complete frame, and with the base, it's more than 11 meters, 45 centimeters high.
The stones reveal that the Pharos was another combination of Egyptian and Greek elements.
You know, this stone speaks by itself. It's granite from Aswan, so it means that it was carved by Egyptian craftsmen. But it was used in this Greek construction of the lighthouse, the symbol of Alexandria.
The doorway was made from 3 solid blocks of granite, each weighing more than 100 tons. It stood almost 30 high. Clearly, any building whose doorway had these monumental proportions must have been big. A major clue to what the whole building looked like lies 30 miles along the coast. Cleopatra researcher Andrea Kay is visiting what some believe to be a copy of the Pharos. Only this is a scaled-down version.
We are at the lighthouse at Taposiris Magna. In Ptolemaic times, this is a very large settlement, and this lighthouse is built on a Ptolemaic cemetery. It probably served as a burial monument of some kind and possibly a signal tower.
The Pharos was at least 4 times the height of this tower. But Andrea Kay believes its shape and proportions are the same.
It's got a large square base with an octagonal middle section and a cylindrical top.
This exactly matches ancient descriptions of the Pharos. Using the design of this lighthouse and the scale dictated by the doorway found in the harbour, it's possible to create a picture of how the landmark at the gateway to Cleopatra's empire might have looked. Standing almost 400 feet high, this was among the tallest buildings on Earth, right up until its destruction in the 14th century. If the builder's intention was to win prestige, it worked.
The Pharaoh's lighthouse was a feat of engineering that welcomed any visitor into the harbour at Alexandria, but it also showed the world that Alexandria was the centre of power in the Mediterranean.
The Ptolemies had a word for it, trophy, sometimes translated into English as luxury, and trophy means everything in excess. Philanthropic endeavors, building endeavors. So whatever it is that you're doing, go over the top when you're doing it. And you could go over the top because you had unlimited resources at your disposal.
This would have been Cleopatra's inheritance, boundless self-belief and the freedom to rule. But the city that Egyptologists are trying to rediscover was under threat. Cleopatra's ancient empire was about to sink from view. Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt, was the product of a unique culture and of extraordinary times. To truly understand her, today's archaeologists are delving into the world which she came from and which she left irrevocably changed. That means looking at Alexandria, the city where events which would alter the course of history were played out. But in the 2,000 years since a Roman army seized Cleopatra's empire, the city's moved on. Alexandria is now a sprawling modern metropolis. Painting a picture of the city that Cleopatra knew involves a lot of detective work. Egyptologist Andrea Kay is using a GPS system to map the exact locations of the few landmarks which survive from antiquity.
We're trying to get a better idea about the layout of the ancient city of Alexandria by mapping it on a computer.
She's collating information gleaned from ancient accounts and from the maps that predate the city's modern development. It enables her to identify where key buildings once stood.
It gives you a better idea of what was there, and by piecing it all together, we can try to complete that picture as best we can to try and understand the kind of city that Cleopatra lived in.
In 2,000 years, the very shape of the landscape has changed. Since Cleopatra's time, there's been a lot of erosion and subsidence of the land. And over the centuries, the old city's been built upon time and time again. Any undiscovered ancient remains lie a long way below street level. For scholars hunting evidence of Cleopatra and the world she knew, the focus of interest has to be on what was the heart of her city, the Palace District.
This would have been a very important part of the city that Cleopatra lived in. She would have lived right over there. It would have been one of the most opulent portions of the city, and the Palace District taking up a whole fifth of the area inside the city walls.